The world of electronic music production is huge, with a ton of different tools out there, and it can be super overwhelming when you're first getting into it. So today I want to break down exactly what you need and what you don't to make electronic music. And it doesn't have to be expensive, and you can ease yourself into it. My name is Gabe Miller. I make electronic music here on YouTube and walk you through the entire process with an emphasis on standalone portable music production devices, but I've also spent a ton of time in digital audio workstations, which I will cover in this video, and have learned a ton about what is actually necessary to get into this world. So let's jump into it. I'm going to break down what you need in a way that will at first seem a bit oversimplified or a bit overwhelming depending on your current experience level, but it'll make more sense as I get into each category. To make electronic music, you need sounds / a way to generate sound, ways to shape those sounds to sound good by themselves and in the context of a mix, an interface to bring all that together and lay those sounds out over time, and a way to hear what you're working with and to control everything. I'm actually going to start this off with the main hub that brings all this together, because it will often contain a bunch of the other tools that you'll end up needing. This is the Digital Audio Workstation, or DAW, and it's the main software that you'll be making music in. Some of the most popular ones out there for making electronic music right now are Ableton, FL Studio, and Logic, but there are a ton of others, and really any DAW can make electronic music if you get the right plugins for it, which I'll get into in a second. The one that I personally use is Reaper, which is a really good, inexpensive option, and it works on Mac, PC, and Linux. So pretty much anyone can just dive into it and start using it. And it's got a really long free trial as well. For all those reasons that I just said, I do highly recommend giving it a go. And I did a dedicated video walking you through the interface and how to use it to make your first song. I'll link that at the end of this video. Any DAW that you buy will have a bunch of tools built in, but you're not limited to those tools. You can also buy or download for free external plugins, which are essentially pieces of software that will pop up inside of your DAW, so they become part of it, essentially. These plugins will include samplers, synthesizers, mixing tools, and effects, which I'll get into all that in a second here. And to help narrow down the entire world of free and paid plugins, I'll recommend some specific ones over the course of this video. So once you've got your DAW, you have set your foundation, and everything else is going to build on top of that. Next up, you are going to want to get some plugins, and specifically plugins that allow you to work with sound and generate sound. There are a few different ways to work with sounds. First of all, you can work with samples, which are just audio files like waves or MP3s. You can lay these directly out on your DAW's timeline, or you can do stuff like map them to a keyboard so you can play chords or melodies with them, or map them to some kind of drum sampler plugin so you can build up whole drum kits that you can play out. A great place to get samples is Splice Sounds, not a sponsor, just a thing that I use all the time. You pay a monthly fee and get a certain amount of sounds per month that you can download, and they've got a giant library to choose from. I also have a $5 one-shot sample pack with a ton of different drum and synth sounds that you can start off with. Link in the description for that. And then you'll probably get some kind of plugin either built into your DAW or externally that can work with those sounds. And the beauty of samples is that because they're just audio files, they can work in pretty much anything and take any form. So I'll link a couple of ways to work with those samples, a couple of plugins in the description below, but let's move on to how to generate sounds. And this is going to be a synthesizer plugin. When using a synthesizer plugin, you can either design sounds by yourself from scratch, or you can use sounds that other people have created using those synthesizer plugins. And these are called presets or patches. And there are a ton of great places to get presets that you can just load up and get to working on music, because getting into sound design is a whole art in of itself and will take some time to learn. So presets, no shame in using them at all. And when it comes to synthesizer plugins, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. You only really need one good one. Reaper, the DAW that I recommend, doesn't really have a good one built in, so you're going to get an external plugin for this, and there are a couple that I recommend checking out. The first is Vital. This one has a very powerful, completely free version, and then you can pay a bit to get a few extra features and to support the creator, because it's either one guy or a small team, which is very impressive what they've built considering that. It's versatile, there are a ton of presets built into it, a visual interface to really get you going and tweaking sounds to how you like them to sound, it's overall a really good option to start off with. It's kind of inspired by my other recommendation, Serum, which is a synth that I've been using for ages, and it's one of the most popular synth plugins, and for good reason. It's also got a very visual interface, it's incredibly powerful, and because it's so popular, you can find a ton of presets for it in a ton of different genres, either free or paid. So this is also a great one to start with, although it does cost a bit of money. You can either buy it up front or use Splice's rent-to-own program, where you pay for it every month as if it's a subscription, and then once you've paid it off, you're just done. And then you can pause it or cancel it at any time. Both of these synthesizer plugins will have everything you need built in to create a wide variety of synth sounds, from more simple, kind of classic sounds to modern bass music. And to show you an example of what they're capable of, here are a few songs I've made using Serum as my only synth. Over time, as you get more experience, you'll probably find yourself buying multiple additional synth plugins. So here are a few things to keep in mind when doing that. First of all, I would avoid synths like Nexus. They can have some cool sounds built in, but plugins like this are built on really hyping you as to the results they can get and then giving you very little control over your sound. So I think they're tremendously overpriced, and I would tend to try to avoid them. If you're not interested in designing sounds yourself, once again, I would just get some good preset packs for your synth of choice. As you get into synthesis, you will also find yourself getting into different types of synthesis. The synthesizers that I recommended, Vital and Serum, work on wavetable synthesis, which is like subtractive synthesis, but spicier. I did an entire video on different kinds of synthesis and how to get into that I will also link at the end of this video. So if these terms mean nothing to you right now, that is perfectly fine. And then there's also stuff like FM synthesis and additive synthesis. Once again, check out that video to learn about what that stuff means, although you don't really need to know that getting in. You just need to know kind of what general sounds to pick and how to use them well. And then over time, you can build up on that baseline of knowledge. Once you have your synthesizer and sampling plugins, you'll be able to use your DAW to put in notes, either recording them yourself or clicking them in, and we can move on to shaping those sounds. Synthesizer and sampler plugins will have a bunch of tools built in, as will your DAW, and there are a few key ones that I really want to highlight. First of all, EQ. This is one of the more important ways to shape your sound, both by itself and to fit into a mix. Imagine your car stereo with bass, mids, and treble knobs. An EQ will typically have all of this and a whole lot more detail in terms of tweaking those parameters. So for instance, you might cut bass on an element that doesn't really need it, or you might boost bass on something that you want to hit really hard. And you might cut or boost different frequencies to bring out certain characteristics of a track or to tame certain characteristics of a track, or you will use high and low cut filters to completely roll off certain parts of the frequency spectrum. Your DAW will probably come with a built-in EQ plugin. That is perfectly fine. I wouldn't get sucked into marketing hype for any fancy EQ plugins, especially not at first. And I should also mention that synthesizers will have their own EQs built in a lot of the time, and will definitely have their own filters built in, which are an important component of sound design. Once again, check out that video on sound design that I'll link at the end of this video if you want to learn more about that. Another mixing tool that I really want to highlight is compression. And this is something that's a little bit hard to understand why you would want it at first, so let me try to explain it the best way I can. Compression essentially looks at all of the peaks of your audio and punches down on the highest ones, and you can set where that threshold is, where it will start punching down on your audio. And the effect that this has is to even audio out, which can be incredibly useful for things like people talking or singing, and can also have some effects as a way to shape your sound. Maybe it'll make a snare drum sound fatter because it evens the sound out. And you can use it across an entire mix that will allow it to get louder overall. which, by the way, if you start getting into making songs and discover that they're way quieter than the music that you look up to, you're going to want to look into using limiters, which are basically really hardcore compressors that you put on top of your entire mix. There's also a specific subset of compression that I want to make sure that I mention, sidechain compression. And this is one way to achieve an effect called ducking, which, let's say we put it on a bass. It will look at what the kick is doing, and then it will duck the bass out of the kick's way. And this is how you get that pumping effect that you'll hear all across EDM and a lot of other electronic music. You can do this with a side-chained compressor, which will literally be applied to the bass, and then it'll look to the kick for when to punch down on the bass. Or you can use volume shaping plugins like LFO Tool, or a free alternative that I will also link in the description that will kind of just follow a preset shape or can be made to follow along with a MIDI file. And once again, you can get this to duck different elements to other elements. With the kick and bass example, here's what that actually sounds like. Your DAW will probably have a pretty good built-in compressor plugin, and then from there you can get more specific stuff as external plugins. For instance, ducking plugins or limiters. And for that matter, your DAW will probably have at least a decent limiter built in as well. Other effects that you'll definitely end up using are reverb and delay, which both kind of put your sound in a space. Reverb will make your sound like it's in the middle of a giant room, for instance, and it'll simulate that effect. Once again, your DAW will probably have a reverb built in, and then there are more specific ones with different characteristics to them that you can get afterwards. And there's also delay, which could also be called echo, because that's exactly what it does. It puts an echo on the sound. Once again, there will probably be a decent one built into your DAW. And of course, there's distortion, one of my favorite effects. And there are some good external plugins out there for that, and your DAW will probably have some sort of distortion, saturator, or bit crusher built in, which all mangle the sound in some way. There are also a ton of other effects out there that you'll use to shape your sound, but those are what I would consider to be the bare essentials. And I would be careful getting into effects that promise the world to you and are priced very high. I would try to go in for free or inexpensive plugins to get the kind of sounds that you want. So at this point, you've got all the software you need and all the tools you need to start making music, other than physical hardware, which will allow you to interface with those tools. For one thing, you're going to need a computer, obviously, and you can use a lot of computers for electronic music production. And don't let people tell you that your computer just isn't powerful enough to do it, because people have been making electronic music on computers for decades, ever since they were super slow and janky. You might have to use some workarounds or be careful to not overload your CPU, but overall, just use what you have and then upgrade as you need to later. You'll also need something to hear your music with, and this that I'm about to say is going to be controversial, but I would say start off with headphones and don't worry about speakers for a while. The thing about speakers is that technically they are more accurate, but that comes with the caveat that in order to be more accurate, you need to be in an acoustically treated room with proper acoustic foam and proper speaker placement to avoid the sound bouncing around your room and warping the sound that you hear, making it less accurate. This can be quite a bit of upfront cost for a new producer and complicated to figure out. So I would recommend just bypassing it entirely and starting with headphones. You can use what you already have, but you're probably going to want something that reproduces the sound pretty accurately, something with a flat frequency response, or at least something that gets in that vicinity. And by flat, I mean it doesn't boost bass too much, or boost high end too much, or cut high end too much, or anything like that. You want something that's fairly accurate. A good budget pair of headphones to look at are the Audio-Technica ATH M50s. These are everywhere in bedroom and professional studios, and for good reason. They are pretty good, although I think they tend to overemphasize high-end just a little bit too much, and they're pretty inexpensive. So that's a good option to at least start with. There's also the topic of MIDI controllers. A MIDI controller acts like a video game controller for your DAW or for your synth plugins. So you'll have a physical keyboard that can't make any sound by itself, but it will plug into your computer and then control your synthesizer plugins. So if you are a musician or have a musical background, this could really come in handy and allow you to actually play parts in, like chord progressions or drum parts or melodies, in live, and then you can like correct the timing and go from there. That can be incredibly nice to have and great as a creative tool, although it's not strictly necessary. You can use your computer keyboard to play notes in if you don't have the money to spend on a MIDI keyboard, although there are some pretty cheap ones out there. Or you can literally click notes in, but not everyone's gonna like doing that. So all of that is what I would consider to be the barest minimum you need to make electronic music. And you can probably get all of this stuff combined if you use a bunch of free software for maybe under $200 if you buy stuff used or get some cheaper headphones or something like that. And of course, this does assume you already have a computer. You don't have to spend a ton of money to get into electronic music production. And I would start with this stuff, start to try to get good with it, make a ton of songs, and then over time, keep learning more, and then you can keep upgrading. For learning material, there's a ton of stuff here on YouTube. I've made a ton of videos in what I'm calling Music Production Crash Course, which this is a part of, that will give you introductions to the basics. And of course, there's stuff out there like Udemy or Skillshare, which can give you some pretty inexpensive, more in-depth tutorials on specific topics like music theory, synthesis, using your DAW, making specific genres, all that kind of stuff. And once you're into that, you can just start going and making music. The other thing that I do want to mention in this video, though, is the thing that I really specialize in on this channel, which is standalone music production devices, because you don't need these, but these can supply a bunch of the tools that I've talked about in this video in a very different format. If you're getting into making electronic music, you're probably going to be using a computer or maybe a tablet or smartphone. But there's also the other option of completely standalone music production devices like the Novation Circuit, Roland MC101, some of the MPCs like the MPC-1 or MPC Live, the OP1, which you've probably had suggested to you on YouTube at some point, so on and so forth. These will give you a bunch of those tools in a standalone box that you can use to make music. And you'll have some sound quality trade-offs or be missing some features and might have a steeper learning curve. But if you're trying to get into electronic music in a really fun, hands-on way, something like a Novation Circuit or Roland MC101 can be a good thing to at least look into. Not necessary at all, but something I definitely spend a lot of time on this channel. If you'd like to continue going down this music production rabbit hole, I've got a few things that I want to point you to. First of all is my video on how to use Reaper, the DAW, to make your first song on it, my video on using synthesizers for a beginner, a playlist of beginner music production videos, both by me and by other people, and a look at some of the best budget standalone music production devices. All that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.